To her own children, she was both mother and sister. From the isolated hills of Kentucky comes the most impure story. There existed a family in the remote hollows of eastern Kentucky, deep where the mist clings to ancient mountains and roads rarely extend beyond one's own property line, whose bloodline became so tangled it defied the natural order itself. This is the story of Sarah Collins, a woman who bore the unimaginable burden of being both mother and sister to the children she bore. A legacy of generations of isolation and familial unions culminated in one of the most disturbing cases of consanguinity ever documented in America's rural history. The year was 1937. While the rest of America struggled through the Great Depression, the isolated communities of eastern Kentucky's Cumberland Plateau existed in a world that was almost entirely their own. The Collins family had lived for over a century, tucked away in a hollow between jagged ridges, accessible only by a winding dirt road that became impassable after heavy rains. They rarely ventured beyond their mountain haven or welcomed outsiders into their fold. These hills were first settled by the Collins clan in the 1830s when Jacob Collins, a rumored fugitive from Pennsylvania, sought refuge in the most remote corner of Kentucky he could find. The isolation that initially provided safety soon became their way of life. As generations passed, the family remained largely cut off from broader society, relying on themselves for survival, for companionship, and eventually, for continuing their bloodline. By the 1900s, the Collins family occupied several adjacent properties, forming a secluded community of their own. Their isolation wasn't just geographical. It was reinforced by their own suspicion of outsiders, their unique customs, and eventually by the whispered rumors that kept neighboring communities at a distance. The outside world had little to offer the Collins family, and they in turn had little desire for its intrusion. In the early 1920s, James Collins, Sarah's father, inherited a small timber operation from his father. The family cut lumber from their extensive mountain property, occasionally trading with nearby settlements when necessary. James had married his first cousin, Martha, following a pattern established over several generations. Their union produced 5 children, 3 of whom survived to adulthood. Sarah was the middle child, born in 1919. The physical toll of generations of familial unions was becoming increasingly apparent in the Collins bloodline. Martha's father was also her uncle, and similar connections riddled their family tree. The children exhibited distinctive facial features, unusually close-set eyes, disproportionate facial structures, and in Sarah's case, a noticeable intellectual impairment that left her childlike even as she physically matured into adulthood. When Sarah turned 16, the devastating pattern continued. Her father, James, following what had become a disturbing family tradition, took his own daughter as his partner after Martha's death during a harsh winter in 1935. This union, hidden from the already limited outside contact the family maintained, would produce children who were simultaneously Sarah's offspring and her siblings, a biological tangle that reflected the increasingly knotted Collins family tree. Dr. Harold Marshfield, a newly graduated physician assigned to the Rural Health Initiative in eastern Kentucky, first encountered the Collins family in 1943. What I discovered in that remote hollow challenges everything we understand about family structure and the consequences of isolation, he would later write in his journals. The genetic decline was immediately apparent, but the social structure that enabled it was what truly disturbed me. Generations of separation from societal norms had created an entirely different understanding of familial relationships. The isolation of families like the Collins wasn't entirely unique in Appalachia during this period. Throughout the Cumberland Plateau, the challenging terrain and limited infrastructure created pockets of extremely isolated communities. Transportation networks developed slowly in these rugged regions, and many people lived in what anthropologists would later term closed communities, with minimal incoming or outgoing migration. While consanguineous relationships weren't as widespread as outside stereotypes suggested, the Collins family represented an extreme case where generations of such practices had continued uninterrupted. By the time authorities became aware of the situation in 1943, Sarah had given birth to 3 children fathered by her own father. These children, who were both her offspring and her half-siblings, showed severe developmental issues. The eldest, a boy of 7, could barely speak and exhibited physical deformities that reflected the compounded genetic issues from generations of consanguinity. The middle child, a girl of 5, appeared to have more severe intellectual disabilities, while the youngest, just 2 years old, already showed signs of developmental delays. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel to learn the shocking truth about America's most isolated communities. The story of the Collins family reveals how decades of seclusion can transform normal family structures into something unrecognizable. Subscribe now to ensure you don't miss the next chapter where we reveal how authorities discovered this hidden family and the community's shocking reaction. The discovery of the Collins family's situation came through a series of coincidences that finally pierced their veil of isolation. The first outsider to glimpse the reality of the Collins Hollow was Thomas Jenkins, a forestry surveyor mapping timber resources for the war effort in 1942. Lost after his truck broke down, Jenkins stumbled upon the Collins property while seeking help. The place seemed frozen in time, Jenkins later reported to authorities. I noticed immediately that something wasn't right about the people there. The woman Sarah had the demeanor of a child, though she had children of her own clinging to her skirts. The older man, who I later learned was both her father and the father of her children, was deeply suspicious of my presence and quickly sent me on my way. But what I saw in those few minutes haunted me enough to report it to the county health office. Jenkins' report initially gathered dust. Resources were stretched thin during wartime and remote mountain families weren't a priority. However, when Dr. Marshfield took his position the following year as part of a rural health initiative, he followed up on several concerning reports, including Jenkins' account of the Collins family. What Marshfield discovered upon reaching the Collins Hollow was a family lineage so intertwined that it resembled a circular pattern rather than the branching tree of normal genealogy. Using county records and information from neighboring communities, he began to piece together the Collins family history, revealing multiple generations of first-cousin marriages, uncle-niece unions, and finally the father-daughter relationship that produced Sarah's 3 children. The degree of consanguinity in the Collins lineage exceeded anything documented in modern medical literature, Marshfield noted in his private journal. The family exhibited classic signs of genetic decline, progressive intellectual disability, characteristic facial abnormalities, reduced fertility among some members, and increased susceptibility to recessive genetic disorders. The youngest generation, born of a father-daughter union that followed several previous generations of close interbreeding, showed the most severe manifestations. The physical appearance of the Collins children became one of the most discussed aspects of the case among medical professionals who later studied Marshfield's documentation. The children displayed unusually small heads, prominent brow ridges, misaligned teeth, and asymmetrical facial features. Their motor skills developed at a fraction of the normal rate, and speech development was severely delayed, or in the case of the middle child, apparently absent. Beyond the physical and cognitive impacts, Marshfield observed behavioral patterns that reflected the isolation and unusual family structure. The children interact as siblings, unaware that their mother is also their sister and that their grandfather is also their father, he wrote. Sarah herself seems unable to fully comprehend the nature of her relationship to her father, having been raised in an environment where such arrangements were normalized over generations. The isolation of this hollow has created not just genetic abnormalities but a complete alternative understanding of family structure. The medical examination of the Collins family revealed the accumulating impact of generations of consanguinity. Blood samples showed unusual patterns of recessive gene expression, and cognitive testing confirmed significant intellectual disabilities throughout the family. Sarah herself functioned at what Marshfield estimated to be the level of an 8-year-old child. Despite being in her early 20s, she was a woman physically capable of motherhood, but cognitively unprepared for its responsibilities. The isolation that enabled the Collins family situation wasn't merely geographical. Cultural isolation played an equally important role. As outside communities gradually developed and modernized through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Collins family remained entrenched in patterns established generations earlier. Without exposure to broader social norms and education, and with increasing genetic factors affecting cognitive development, the family had created an insular world with its own rules and structures. James Collins, when initially confronted by authorities, displayed no recognition that his relationship with his daughter violated any natural or social law. In his isolated world, where his own parents had been closely related, the progression to a father-daughter union seemed to represent merely a continuation of established family patterns. This cognitive disconnect highlighted how thoroughly the family had become detached from mainstream society and its taboos. The neighbors in nearby hollows had long held suspicions about the Collins family but adhered to the mountain code of minding one's own business. "We knew something wasn't right up in that hollow," one local resident told Marshfield. "But mountain folk don't interfere in family matters unless there's clear danger. We didn't realize how far it had gone until your people brought those children down to the county seat." When Marshfield presented his findings to county authorities, the case presented unprecedented challenges. No clear precedent existed for handling such an extreme situation of multigenerational consanguinity. The immediate concern was for the welfare of the children, who clearly required medical attention and developmental support beyond what their isolated hollow could provide. Yet removing them from the only home they knew presented its own trauma. Sarah's position in the situation posed particularly difficult questions. Legally an adult, but functionally a child herself, she was both victim and, in the eyes of some authorities, participant in the family's dysfunctional structure. Marshfield advocated strongly that she be viewed primarily as a victim, a product of generations of isolation and previous consanguineous relationships that had left her without the cognitive capacity to understand or resist the situation she was placed in. Sarah Collins represents the culmination of over a century of progressive isolation, Marshfield wrote in his official report. She is simultaneously a cause and effect of the family's genetic decline. Born of a consanguineous union herself, then bearing children in another such union, all within an isolated environment that normalized these relationships. Her case challenges our medical, legal, and ethical frameworks, requiring us to look beyond judgment to intervention and prevention. By early 1944, the Collins case had begun to draw attention beyond the county level. State health authorities became involved, and a team of specialists from the University of Kentucky traveled to examine the family and document what was becoming recognized as an extraordinary case study in the effects of prolonged genetic isolation and consanguinity. Dr. Eleanor Ridgway, a geneticist who joined the university team, conducted the most thorough analysis of the Collins family genetics. "What we observed in the Collins lineage represents an almost laboratory-pure example of genetic decline through consanguinity," she noted in her research. The family's isolation created a closed genetic system where recessive traits became increasingly expressed with each generation. By the time of Sarah's children, we observed a concentration of genetic abnormalities that would be virtually impossible in a diverse genetic population. The medical examination of the Collins children revealed multiple health concerns beyond their obvious developmental delays. The oldest boy suffered from a heart condition common in cases of recessive gene expression. The middle child experienced seizures that became increasingly frequent as she grew older. The youngest, while showing fewer physical abnormalities, demonstrated severe delays in cognitive development that suggested significant neurological impacts. I hope you're feeling what I'm feeling right now, the profound tragedy of this family's situation. If you're as invested in understanding these hidden American histories as I am, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. We're uncovering stories that shaped our nation but were hidden from public view for decades. Hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss a single revelation. The state authorities faced difficult decisions regarding the Collins family. James Collins was ultimately charged with offenses against his daughter, though the legal framework of the time struggled to address the complex reality of the situation. Sarah and her children were relocated to a state facility where they could receive appropriate medical care and support, a transition that proved traumatic despite being necessary for their well-being. Dr. Marshfield documented Sarah's response to the intervention. She appears simultaneously relieved and distressed by the separation from her father. Her emotional attachment to him transcends typical family bonds, reflecting the confused relational boundaries that defined her upbringing. She speaks of him as both father and partner without apparent recognition of the contradiction this represents. The three Collins children responded differently to their new environment. The oldest boy, initially withdrawn and fearful, gradually began to engage with caretakers and showed surprising potential for development when provided with appropriate educational support. The middle child's health issues proved more challenging, with her seizure condition requiring ongoing medical intervention. The youngest, removed from the isolated hollow before many patterns had been firmly established, demonstrated the greatest capacity for adaptation to the new environment. While the Collins case was unfolding, anthropologists began to develop a more nuanced understanding of Appalachian isolation and its effects. Robert Tenure, whose research would later be published as Night Comes to the Chromosomes, Inbreeding and Population Genetics in Southern Appalachia, was among the first to systematically study marriage patterns in the region. His work would eventually challenge some of the stereotypes about widespread inbreeding while acknowledging that isolated cases like the Collins family did exist. The Collins case represents an extreme outlier rather than a regional norm, Tenure would later write. Their extraordinary level of isolation, geographical, social, and eventually genetic, created conditions that were unusual, even within the context of historically isolated Appalachian communities. Most mountain families, while relatively isolated compared to urban populations, maintained sufficient genetic diversity through occasional outmarriage and community interaction. The broader community's reaction to the Collins case reflected the complex attitudes toward family privacy and autonomy in Appalachian culture. Many locals expressed horror at the specific situation while simultaneously resenting outside intervention in mountain affairs. "That wasn't right what happened up there," one neighbor told researchers. "But we don't much care for government men coming in and telling mountain folk how to live. Most families here keep to themselves, but know the difference between right and wrong." For Sarah, the transition to institutional care marked the first time she had regularly interacted with people outside her immediate family. Caretakers reported that she initially struggled with basic social conventions and seemed confused by the structured routines of the facility. Her attachment to her children remained strong, though professionals noted that her interactions sometimes more closely resembled sibling relationships than parent-child bonds, a reflection of her own confused position as both mother and sister. When Sarah plays with her children, there's an equality to their interactions that differs from typical mother-child dynamics, observed Elizabeth Harmon, a social worker assigned to the family. She engages with them as peers in many ways, lacking the natural authority and guidance of a mother figure. This isn't surprising given her own developmental level and the confused family structure she was raised in. The case gradually transformed from an immediate intervention to a long-term study in the effects and treatment of severe consanguinity impacts. Medical professionals from across the country consulted on the Collins family, contributing to an evolving understanding of genetic disorders and developmental disabilities. The children, in particular, became important case studies in the potential for intervention and support to mitigate the effects of genetic challenges. In the mountains, the Collins Hollow stood empty, a silent testament to the dangers of extreme isolation. Neighboring families, previously hesitant to discuss the Collins clan, gradually began to share stories that revealed signs of concern had existed for generations. "My grandmother used to say there was something not right about how the Collins kept to themselves," one elderly resident recalled. She said they stopped coming to community gatherings back in her mother's day. And when they did show up, the children didn't seem right, slow to speak and odd-looking. Folks wondered but didn't pry. That's the mountain way. When you watch this story and feel the emotions stirring inside you, I want you to leave a comment saying, "This history must not be forgotten." Your comment helps ensure these crucial stories reach more people who need to understand America's hidden past. Type those words now, "This history must not be forgotten," so I know you're with me in preserving these important narratives. By 1950, the Collins case had become an important reference point in medical literature regarding consanguinity and its effects. Follow-up studies on Sarah and her children provided valuable longitudinal data on the development and treatment of individuals affected by severe genetic issues resulting from inbreeding. While protecting the family's privacy by changing names and published materials, the medical community used the insights gained to improve understanding of genetic counseling and intervention. Dr. Ridgway, continuing her research with the family, documented the children's developmental trajectories over several years. The remarkable finding in the Collins children is the varying capacity for improvement when provided with appropriate support. While all three continue to experience significant limitations, their divergent responses to intervention highlight the complex interplay between genetic factors and environmental influence. The oldest boy, initially given a poor prognosis, showed unexpected progress in language development and basic academic skills, though he continued to function well below age-appropriate levels. By age 15, he had achieved functional communication and sufficient self-care skills to suggest the possibility of supported independent living as an adult, an outcome few had predicted when he was first evaluated. The middle child's development remained more severely impacted, complicated by her ongoing seizure disorder. Despite intensive therapeutic intervention, she achieved only limited verbal communication and required continuous supervision. Her case illustrated the more profound and resistant effects that could result from compounded genetic issues. The youngest child presented the most encouraging trajectory, achieving near-appropriate milestones in several developmental areas after 5 years of intervention. While still exhibiting some cognitive delays and characteristic physical features that marked his genetic heritage, his progress suggested that early intervention could significantly mitigate some effects of consanguinity. Sarah herself experienced meaningful but limited progress. With consistent support and education, she developed greater independence in daily living skills and formed appropriate social connections within the supportive environment of the state facility. Her cognitive functioning remained at approximately the same level, but her adaptive skills improved markedly, allowing her to participate more fully in the care of her children within a supervised setting. The case contributed significantly to emerging discussions about the prevention of similar situations. Public health initiatives in Appalachia began to include more extensive outreach to isolated communities, with educational programs addressing the risks of consanguineous relationships. These initiatives required careful cultural sensitivity, acknowledging the independence and privacy valued by mountain communities while providing critical health information. Dr. Marshfield, who continued to work with rural Appalachian communities throughout his career, reflected on the broader implications of the Collins case. While this family represented an extreme situation, their story highlighted the need for accessible health services and education in isolated regions. The most effective prevention isn't external control, but ensuring that even the most remote communities have access to the knowledge and resources needed to make informed decisions. The academic understanding of Appalachian isolation also evolved. In the wake of the Collins case and similar studies, researchers recognized that the stereotype of widespread inbreeding in the mountains had been greatly exaggerated, often used to dismiss the region's economic challenges as self-inflicted rather than acknowledging the structural factors that contributed to Appalachian poverty. At the same time, they documented the real impacts of geographical isolation on community health and development. By the mid-1950s, improvements in regional infrastructure, roads, schools, and healthcare facilities, had begun to reduce the extreme isolation that characterized communities like the Collins Hollow. A post-war economic expansion, while unevenly distributed, brought new opportunities for employment and education that gradually connected previously isolated mountain communities to the broader society. For the Collins children, the 1950s brought transitions as they approached adulthood. The oldest, now in his late teens, was enrolled in a vocational training program that built on his strengths while accommodating his limitations. The middle child remained in residential care, requiring ongoing medical support for her seizure condition. The youngest, showing the most promising development, was placed with a foster family with the goal of eventual mainstream education with support services. Sarah remained in institutional care, where she had developed a stable routine and formed appropriate attachments to caregivers and fellow residents. Her relationship with her children evolved as they grew older and their cognitive development in some cases surpassed her own, a unique dynamic that required careful support from the professionals working with the family. James Collins served a limited sentence, reduced in consideration of the cultural context and his own limited understanding of the situation. Upon release, he chose not to return to the isolated hollow but instead relocated to a small town in western Kentucky, where he lived quietly until his death in 1962. He never attempted to contact Sarah or the children again, whether from legal restriction, personal choice, or some combination remains unclear from the records. The Collins Hollow itself gradually returned to wilderness. The abandoned homestead, with its weathered cabin and overgrown fields, became a silent monument to the dangers of extreme isolation. Occasionally, local teenagers would venture there on dares, perpetuating whispered stories about the family that had lived there, stories that grew increasingly distorted with each retelling until they bore little resemblance to the actual human tragedy that had unfolded. By 1960, the Collins case had faded from public attention, though it remained an important reference in medical literature. The family members continued their lives away from public scrutiny, their privacy protected by institutional policies and changing names. The immediate intervention had transitioned to long-term care and support, with the focus shifting from the sensational aspects of the case to the ongoing human needs of the individuals involved. For medical and social work professionals, the lasting impact of the Collins case was in highlighting both the specific genetic consequences of consanguinity and the broader social factors that could enable such situations. The case influenced approaches to outreach in isolated communities and contributed to a more nuanced understanding of the support needed by individuals with genetic disorders and developmental disabilities. As the decades passed, the Collins family story gradually transformed from current event to historical case study. By the 1970s, new generations of medical and social work students encountered the case under pseudonyms as an important example in their textbooks, studying the genetic and social patterns without knowing the real names or specific location of the family involved. The actual individuals continued their lives outside the public eye, their privacy maintained even as their story informed professional practice. The oldest Collins child, after completing vocational training, lived most of his adult life in a supported community setting. Despite his limitations, he achieved a level of independence that exceeded early expectations, working in a sheltered workshop and participating in community activities with appropriate support. He passed away in 1988 at the age of 52, having experienced health complications common in individuals with similar genetic backgrounds. The middle child required lifelong care due to her more severe disabilities and ongoing seizure condition. She lived in specialized residential facilities where dedicated staff provided the continuous support she needed. Despite her limited communication abilities, caregivers noted her responsiveness to music and nature, small pleasures that enriched a life defined by significant challenges. She passed away in 1979 at age 41 from complications related to her seizure disorder. The youngest child achieved the highest level of independence. After successful placement with a foster family and specialized education, he developed sufficient skills to live semi-independently as an adult. He married another individual with mild intellectual disabilities whom he met through a supported employment program. The couple did not have children, a decision informed by genetic counseling regarding the risks associated with his family history. He lived until 2010, reaching the age of 69. Sarah Collins spent the remainder of her life in institutional settings, though the nature of those institutions evolved significantly over the decades. From the initially restrictive environment of the 1940s, she transitioned through various facilities as approaches to supporting individuals with intellectual disabilities became more focused on dignity, choice, and community integration. She maintained her childlike perspective throughout her life, finding simple joy in crafts, music, and the visits of those who cared for her. Sarah passed away in 1982 at the age of 63. The medical understanding of consanguinity and its effects advanced considerably in the decades following the Collins case. The development of genetic testing and counseling provided new tools for identifying and managing risks. However, the fundamental findings from the Collins study regarding the compounding effects of multigenerational consanguinity and the importance of early intervention remained relevant in modern genetic medicine. The social context that enabled the Collins situation changed dramatically over the same period. The extreme isolation that characterized their hollow became increasingly rare as transportation networks, telecommunications, and economic changes connected previously remote communities to the broader society. While some Appalachian regions continue to face significant challenges related to poverty and access to services, the complete isolation that had sheltered the Collins family from outside influence became largely a thing of the past. By the early 21st century, the Collins case had become primarily historical, a reflection of conditions that no longer existed in the same form. Yet the human story at its center retained its power to illustrate the profound consequences of isolation and the complex interplay between environment, genetics, and human development. For professionals working in genetics, developmental psychology, and social services, the case continued to offer valuable insights despite the passing decades. Dr. Marshfield, who first documented the Collins family situation, continued working in rural health until his retirement in the 1970s. In his final professional publication, he reflected on the case that had defined the early years of his career. The Collins family represents both a tragic consequence of extreme isolation and a testament to human resilience and adaptability. While their story began in circumstances few of us can imagine, the response of each family member to intervention and support revealed the remarkable capacity for growth that exists even in the most challenging situations. The hollow where the Collins family lived eventually became part of a national forest. The exact location of their homestead was lost to all but the most dedicated local historians. The physical traces of their presence, the cabin, outbuildings, and small family cemetery, gradually disappeared beneath the advancing forest, reclaimed by the wilderness from which they had been temporarily carved. In academic circles, the Collins case continued to be referenced in discussions of genetic isolation, though always with the appropriate privacy protections. Their story contributed to improved understanding of rare genetic conditions and informed approaches to supporting individuals with similar challenges. In this way, a family situation that began in isolation and tragedy ultimately contributed to knowledge that benefited many others. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the Collins family story was in the evolution of services for individuals with developmental disabilities. The institutional model that initially received Sarah and her children gradually gave way to approaches emphasizing community integration, personal choice, and dignity. While this transformation was driven by broader social movements, cases like the Collins family highlighted the human needs at the center of these services and the importance of individualized, compassionate support. The story of Sarah Collins, who was both mother and sister to her own children, remains a powerful reminder of the consequences of extreme isolation and the complexity of human development. It stands as a historical marker of conditions that once existed in the most remote hollows of Appalachia, while emphasizing the universality of human needs for connection, understanding, and support. Though the specific circumstances that led to the Collins family situation have largely disappeared from American society, the insights gained from their story continue to inform our understanding of the delicate interplay between genetics, environment, and human potential. If you've stayed with this story until the end, it means you truly care about understanding these hidden chapters of American history. Please leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can get to know who truly values these important narratives. And if this story moved you, please hit the like button and share it with others who appreciate learning about the complex realities of our nation's past. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel for more compelling historical investigations that shed light on forgotten stories that shaped our society.